Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ask NPR News. I'm Angela Davis, and before I introduce NPR News Deputy Managing Editor Nancy Liebens, I want to remind you that we are in the middle of the NPR News Winter Member Drive. Members power public radio, and we certainly could not do the work that we do without you and your financial support. So I want to remind you that you can go to nprnews.org or call us at 800-227-2811 to make a donation. Now, when you make a donation, you will be supporting NPR's coverage of a major trial that is scheduled to begin in March, the trial of Derek Chauvin. He is the former Minneapolis police officer who kneeled on George Floyd's neck last May. Chauvin is charged with murder and manslaughter, and that trial is scheduled to start very soon, as you know. So today, we want to give you a chance to ask some questions about that trial and how NPR News is approaching the coverage of both the trial and the community's reaction to it. George Floyd's killing and the protests and civil unrest that followed were among the biggest stories that many of us journalists here at NPR in our newsroom that we have ever covered. It's a high-profile case, and it involves complex issues like racism and the controversy surrounding police use of force. All of this has really led our reporters, our producers, our editors, our photojournalists, our hosts to really take extra care with things like language and decisions about which aspects of the story to focus on. So, you, our listeners, you have asked us questions all along about our coverage, and now is a chance to ask more questions and get you some answers. You can use the Q&A button below to submit a question during this discussion. Right now, I want to introduce you to my colleague, Nancy Liebens. Nancy is, as I mentioned, a deputy managing editor here at NPR News. She's overseen news coverage of multiple confrontations between police and people suspected of crimes. And Nancy is among the editors behind some of the coverage decisions being made at NPR News right now when it comes to this upcoming trial. Hi there, Nancy.
Hi.
Hi. And like many of our NPR colleagues, you are working from home and joining us
Yep.
on Zoom today. So thank you for making time for us. I appreciate it.
You're more than welcome. I'm so glad so many people have decided to join. This is awesome.
Yeah. I keep taking deep breaths because I mean, this really is it's a unprecedented time for so many reasons, and
Yeah.
just me as a person who's a news consumer, as well as someone who covers the news. I just have a lot of angst and a lot of worry as we approach the start of the first trial. So let's
Yeah.
start with that. The upcoming trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. He's charged with murder and manslaughter, as I mentioned, in the killing of George Floyd last May. So when does the trial officially start? When does it get going?
So officially it starts on March 8th. That is the schedule right now. I should say anything can still happen. Um, but that's what we're expecting is that we'll start on time on March 8th, and it will start with jury selection.
Mm.
And jury selection may take 3 weeks. It may take a couple weeks. We just don't know for sure. But they're expecting that the opening statements will happen on March 29th, on or before March 29th. And
Okay,
the
so
trial could last for a couple months.
yeah, that's
So
one of the questions that Anna, when she registered, she asked, "How long will this trial last?"
yeah, yeah. I mean, I looked back just to refresh my memory on the Nora trial, which was similar to this in some ways. I mean, it was a trial of a police officer in a fatal shooting, and that took a month. It
Hmm.
started on April 1st and it was done on April 30th.
And the jury
So,
selection process that involves the attorneys on both sides having an
mhm.
opportunity to say yes or no to potential jurors.
Right. They will be asking them questions about that will sort of indicate whether they might have prejudicial feelings, how much news media they've consumed, how the news accounts have shaped how they feel about the case. They might ask about personal experiences that people have had, opinions that they have on other cases, perhaps, and they'll just be listening for people who have made up their minds in some way as to whether Derek Chauvin is guilty or innocent. So Yeah,
Here's a
it's going to be
um,
complicated, needless to say.
right, here's a question, Carol is asking, "What is the likelihood of getting a jury that isn't already prejudiced in the case, and how will
Yeah,
that be handled?" Because we know early on there were conversations about change of venue.
right. And that argument didn't last for very long. I think it was always assumed that Hennepin County was probably the best place to handle a huge profile trial of this nature. I mean, I think that's a question that might be something that continues after the trial is over.
Mhm,
But it's hard to say how difficult this is going to be. And I think it's definitely worth, jury selection maybe isn't something that the public is very involved in paying attention to, but maybe in this case, it's
mhm.
really, really important to listen. And we expect that feed of the trial and what's going on will be accessible to anybody who can tune in. So that's different.
Let
You won't be
let's
sitting there.
Right, let's talk about some of the logistics and just
Yeah,
how our NPR News reporters will cover, the trial and the jury selection during a pandemic, because there are lots of new restrictions on where we can even be.
right. So we're still sussing out the details. And I should add that at this point, we have a team that's been covering the aftermath
Mhm,
for a long time, since June.
mhm.
And that team is led by Laura Ewan, who's an editor here at NPR News. And we have 5 reporters who are, you know, basically that is their main job, is to cover the trial, or 4 reporters at least. And 2 of them will be in there's a broadcast room actually that we will have seats in. That's what we're hoping.
Just for the
Um,
media?
for the media, right?
Mhm.
There are seats inside the courtroom. There are 2 pool seats, one for print, one for TV.
And
Um,
pool seats, explain to people what that means,
yeah,
if
sorry.
they don't know.
Stop me anytime I have jargon, right? So a pool is basically, as a pool reporter, you're there to be a reporter, but you're not just representing your news organization. You have to share everything that you have
Mhm.
found out with the pool.
You're
So
representing everybody, right? Mhm,
reporters typically come out and say, "This is, what I heard, what I saw." So there will be cameras. We don't know where they're going to be aimed, but we can be pretty sure that they won't be aimed at the jury.
mhm.
So a reporter sitting in the trial inside the courtroom might be watching the jury to see, down the road when the trial is going on, seeing, what reactions people have to different evidence and witnesses. Um, and so
And
that's why it's nice to be in the actual room as opposed to looking on the camera, because you probably will see the judge and you may see the defendant. But
it's a whole different, as a television
yeah,
news reporter for many years, particularly when I worked down in Texas, when we could be in the courtroom and we had cameras in the courtroom, what you could see in terms of body language, the reaction on the jurors' faces, you could, hear, um, how they would react, who they looked at as testimony. I mean, it really is a different experience to be in the courtroom than to watch or feed, and you can catch things and then record things that you
right.
wouldn't otherwise be able to.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so
Exactly.
we'll have
And
some of
watch the
that.
defendant too. And there's just all kinds of
Mhm.
things that happen, especially if you have a full courtroom full of people too who are reacting.
Right.
And that
Yeah, you
won't
can
be the
see the
case this
family
time.
members. Yeah,
Yeah.
how the family members interact, how they enter the
Hmm.
room, all of that.
Yeah.
And what is allowed here for this particular trial in terms of video and audio?
So, and again, this plan is still evolving, but what we know is that Court TV will handle the feed out of the courtroom. And this is something, by the way, just to back up a little bit, is something that NPR News, in addition to other news media in Minnesota, have pushed for. Given we knew with COVID that we were going to be very limited in terms of where we could be in the courtroom, and we wanted to make sure that we had a much easier way to report this, regardless, because there's just so much interest.
Mhm.
And it was very difficult during the trial of Muhammad Noor. So we managed to get this agreement to have the feed. So in this separate area that reporters will be in there, and also what would be streamed or on court TV would be, what you would see in the courtroom plus the audio. So we're still trying to work out our plans in terms of how we will present this. But the intention is to have it so that people can listen to the whole thing, which, unless you were lucky to get a seat in the courtroom, does not happen in Minnesota. It happens for sentencing, but not for the whole trial. So
So
that's very unique.
let's talk about the complexities of audio and video in this particular trial, because we know the video and audio is very traumatic. And so the,
Exactly.
the evidence that will be presented, much of it captured from police body cam, much of it captured from, cameras that were on people's phones.
Mhm.
And, for me, just thinking about reliving all of that, we have to give some thought, like, what do we want to share with our
Exactly.
audiences? In terms of hearing, George Floyd's last words, or hearing officers, talking to each other, or hearing people who were watching what was happening, yelling and interacting with the police. How do we handle that?
Well, it is an ongoing conversation, because it can cut both ways too, because people will also say, well, we want the whole thing, you know. But we have to be sensitive to people re-experiencing trauma, and how much pain is involved in this has been involved this whole time. I mean, unlike, I go back to the trial of Muhammad Noor, that was almost 2 years. This has been less than a year. So I mean, even that process time hasn't happened. It may never happen. Wouldn't happen in
Right.
2 years probably.
From Memorial Day to when it happened to the trial start, a short
Yeah,
period of time. Mm.
I feel like it's a relatively short period of time. Yeah. So I would say to the audience, we are very sensitive to it. And I think it's an ongoing conversation that we have with everybody in the newsroom. Make sure that everybody who has thoughts about this, who's, you know, willing to talk about what it feels to them, even, to come forward and
Mhm.
say that and help us make this decision. Not to put it on people, but we want to make sure we're not missing anything as far as that goes. But
And Nancy, I know you don't oversee our website, but we will
mhm,
have obviously an opportunity to post images on
yes,
nprnews.org as well. So
yep,
we have to, and video as well. So
yep,
we have to give some thought to
yep.
that.
And in the past, we've had time to look at video and think about what we were putting on.
Mhm.
So not having that break is something we have to think about too.
All right, here's a question from Mary. Mary is asking, will you be interviewing any of George Floyd's family members? And I guess because most of them live out of state, right? They live in Texas, but the assumption is that they will be traveling to Minnesota for the trial.
Right. I mean, we have talked to family members, and we would like to talk to them if they will talk to us. Um, we very much would want to hear what they're feeling, what they're thinking, if they want to do that. But yes, we are in touch with them and have talked with them.
A question coming in from Ellen. Ellen asks, will you be giving the audience a heads up if there's video or audio that children shouldn't see? A lot of times in television news coverage, they'll give you a warning, like a warning, these images are graphic, or what you're about to hear might be disturbing. You may want to
Yeah.
ask children to leave the room. Is that something we do on NPR News?
I don't know if we've had it to this extent. You
Right.
know, in the past we have, there's a different standard for a broadcast than online.
Hmm.
But some of the same principles apply. So I don't want to avoid the question, but I think that's something we're still trying to figure out
Yeah.
too. And
I
I
know
don't
we
want to get
bleep
ahead
out
of the digital folks.
bad words. I've got the list of naughty words we can't ever say or ever be heard on the air, but
Yeah, that's
yeah.
that. You can
Hmm.
hear them online, but
Yeah.
I think we would know some ahead of time. We would know, okay, today is the day when they're going to present this this graphic video or whatever.
Mhm.
And
So that
and I'm not sure how Court TV is gonna even handle that, is the other question.
so Court
So
TV, it's been a long time since I watched a lot of
I
cable,
know, me
but
too.
Court TV, that's that 24-hour court,
Mhm.
cable channel. They're
Yeah,
planning to broadcast as much as they can of the
I
their
believe, yes. I mean, they're
during the trial
responsible for the feed
for the feed.
outside. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Here's a question from Karen. Karen wrote to us with concerns that news organizations focus on conflict and unrest and don't give enough time to coverage of efforts like mutual and deep conversations happening within community groups like churches, etc. What's your response to that? Now, I know on our talk shows that that we've done, we've talked about healing and even creating spaces where people can come together, and that's something that I know my talk show team and I have been talking about right now, planning like what is the most useful thing that we can do during the trial, because we're different than the reports that you hear in newscasts. And I'm really focusing on like creating a space where people can reflect, and talk about how they're responding and feeling about it and trying to figure out who are the best voices to include in that. And
Right.
obviously, during the talk shows, we open the phone lines and people can share what they're thinking and feeling. But I feel like in the last year, we have spent a lot of time talking about how, conversations that are now occurring because of what happened back in May.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think everybody probably knows, but I'll just make sure that it's out there that we're also a statewide network. And so
Mhm.
we have focused on the immediate issues in terms of what to do about the police department. And we've covered that as a almost a daily news story for a long time. And we continue to cover it because it's still a conversation in the Minneapolis City Council. And but beyond that, we also had people in greater Minnesota talk about their activism and how their activism spark, you
Mhm.
know, either accelerated or just became lit all of a sudden.
Mhm.
Um, and and that actually is a series you can find. It's called Voices of Change. You would have to say Voices of Change NPR News if you want to look at that whole, those individual responses to
Yes, sir. Uh,
racism and that kind of thing. But we've also we would like to do more stories on how change can happen, maybe economically. We have with the pandemic, we've tried to talk about how the coronavirus is affecting particularly um, Black people in Minnesota and also Latinos been
mhm.
really hit hard.
The
Um,
disparities we've seen,
and the
right?
disparities of vaccinations at the moment. So that's still a conversation I think we're having. I'm not sure I answered that fully, but it is, I know we're trying to hear individual voices as opposed to the usual suspects, if that makes sense.
Right, the people who
Um,
represent communities, we've really gone
yep,
after individuals. You're right. I agree
yep.
with that.
And the other thing we're
Um,
trying to do, just in terms of our own, the way we do our work, we are tracking diverse sources in our stories too, and making much more. We've always had that effort, but we're making much, or not always, but we have lately had that even before Floyd was killed. So it's still, we're trying to make it a muscle that we always use, if
I
that
want to get to
makes
some of
sense.
these questions that people are asking about the possible outcomes of the trial, and how we position ourselves to cover that and what we're thinking about. Nick is asking, do you have contingency plans for all the possible verdicts the jury may reach? And I guess that means like, are we thinking like, where do we position people or anticipate what could happen if there's guilty, not guilty, or like what could happen?
Yeah, I think what the way we approach it is we plan for the biggest and work our way back. So we want to make sure that we are, and not that we expect we don't know what's going to happen.
We do
Um,
know that people will be unhappy regardless of what. There'll be some people that are celebrating. There'll be some people who are
right.
unhappy.
And we're already hearing people are protesting no matter what. Even before the
Right.
trial starts, they're going to be. Um, protesting treatment by police.
Mhm.
So we'll be covering that. Um, and we will have people outside the courtroom when the verdict comes down. And we will have plans to scale up that response quickly if need be. And what we found in the coverage of what happened immediately after George Floyd's death is that things had kind of a rolling nature to them and would sometimes really escalate depending on what was happening, and sometimes get really quiet. So we just kind of have to be prepared for things that could happen in Minneapolis, that could be happening in St. Paul. We know that the city and the state is taking the security pretty seriously in terms of having National Guard ready, and different police forces, but we're still exploring what that's going to look like. Um, and but yeah, like everybody, we're prepared for things we never thought we would prepare for, to be honest with you, before any of this happened. I mean, and
And
since
what
the Capitol riot, of course, too.
Right. And what about safety of all members of the media, but in particular, our NPR News reporters and photojournalists who will be at the, and I failed to mention where this is actually happening, downtown Minneapolis, the
Right.
the Hennepin County
Yep.
Government Center, the
Hennepin
courthouse,
County
right?
Courthouse and
And
Government
I've
Center
seen
area.
pictures. They've got barbed wire fences already up, right? What is being done? What are our managers doing to make sure our reporters and photojournalists who are out in the field that they're safe? What can be done?
Yeah. We do have, I don't want to go into too much details as to what we actually give them, but I will say that their safety is the most important thing to us. And if reporters, this has always been the case, even before this happened, and people were trying to figure out if they should go out because of the pandemic, right?
Mhm.
So if people felt uncomfortable about being out, if they were feeling in danger, they're the best ones to make a judgment on that and to respond and to stay in touch with us. And so we do have buddy systems, and
So folks are never
so
alone. You're never by yourself,
exactly.
right?
Yep. And
Yeah,
that's
can watch
that's
out for each
new. We
other.
didn't, I mean,
Mhm.
we thought about it before with say the protests um, in the wake of the acquittal of the officer involved in killing Philando Castile. And there were big demonstrations with that, but it's just a different world now, I think.
Mhm.
Um, and and we're just seeing a bit more of the escalation of things, like people using fireworks
Right.
and driving really fast. I mean,
Mhm.
it's just kind of strange stuff that does happen too, that you just have to be aware of. The crowds themselves had been fairly peaceful all the way through, and the large protests, but then things could change also. So we kind of have to be aware of what could change while reporting as fairly as we can what's happening in front of us. But we can only see what's right in front of us.
Nancy, as we look back, we're going to talk about language. A lot of people, several people are asking about how we make decisions about the language we are using. Why do we say the killing of George Floyd rather than the death of George Floyd? Why do we say the killing of George Floyd rather than George Floyd was murdered? A lot of conversations happened in the immediate hours
Mhm.
after this occurred. Let's start with the word choice. Why do we use the word killing rather than death or murder? I've received voicemails, I've received emails,
Yeah,
but this doesn't just happen randomly. We just don't get on the air and
no,
say what comes to mind.
no, we don't. And in this case, I think to go back to the beginning as far as how we knew about it, we meaning the general public, the bystander video really shows a pretty clear picture about what's going on there.
Mhm.
And the other thing is the medical examiner did say it was a homicide.
Cause of death is homicide.
correct. So a a violent death occurred. And we do use death and killing both. What we don't use is murder, and as in George Floyd was murdered. We don't say that.
But we do
Murder,
say he's charged with murder.
we do say that, and that so
Chauvin is charged with murder.
right, because the Derek Chauvin, um, his charges are second degree intentional murder and manslaughter, second degree manslaughter. So we say he's been charged with or charged in the killing or in the death, actually, of George Floyd, because that's a legalistic determination. And so this is the prosecutors alleging that this happened, and it's their case. So it's difficult in this situation because we're seeing something, people say, I see with my own eyes this, but there's a medical examiner's report that will come up in the trial that is sure to become a really important part of the trial. Actually, if people are wondering, when do I watch, when do I pay attention, I would suggest that that's a really important part to watch and see how that works out.
Mhm. And there was
Um,
more than one autopsy, right? Because the family had an independent autopsy done, and then the Hennepin County medical examiner also did an autopsy,
correct.
which had
We
some similarities and some differences.
right, and um, we were told about the results of the family autopsy, which said asphyxiation was the cause. This independent autopsy that they had, that they say they had, and then the Hennepin County medical examiner's report, which uh, attributed the death to a number of different factors.
Mhm.
And of course, one being he was kneeled on
Mhm.
um, across his
That was
neck.
part of it. Mhm.
But there are also other factors, including the medical examiner noted fentanyl in his system, methamphetamine in his system, that he had a
Mhm.
pre-existing heart condition. So I think all of that, I mean, from the beginning, I think in June, the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, said this is going to be a really difficult case to try.
And even
So,
with, I mean, like every step of this has been complicated. I mean, we just even who's prosecuting it, because it started
mhm,
out being the
right,
Hennepin County Attorney's Office, and then it's like, nope, well, they're involved, but now it's the Attorney General's office that is
yes,
leading the prosecution. But is the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, they're still providing support? Is that correct?
that's our understanding.
Right.
Yeah,
So just going back to what you were saying, jury selection starts, March 8th.
8th.
Probably three, like the dates could move and change because
Right.
come up, right?
And it's still so a week and a half away, right? Or little less, a
Hmm.
little more than that. I mean, things could even change as far as the date of the trial in terms of the charges. The prosecutors are still trying to add a third degree murder
Hmm.
charge. And so it's something we cover as a daily news story. Um, in addition to trying to take long views when we can.
And I'm curious, one of the things, particularly during the winter member drive, that we've tried to remind people is that just the variety of news stories that we have, because we have obviously the trial coverage, we have politics and business and entertainment, but how do we, as an editor, how do we figure out what's the right combination to be, sharing with people? Are we doing too much trial coverage? Are we doing too much? Is it not enough? I mean, it's hard to know. Like, I is it every day we tell you what's the latest thing, or because those are decisions that you all have to make. Like,
Mhm.
what's too much and what's not enough?
I believe that during the trial, and probably, I mean, I would say it's a pretty safe bet in the lead up to the trial that there will be something almost every day that we can say about the
Hmm.
issue about police accountability and how do cities hold police accountable? How do they change the departments? And just what's going on in the lead up to the trial in terms of maneuvering by the different sides. Um, and and also the security issue too, because there's still things we don't know yet about what's going to happen as far as funding and things like that. So yeah,
I want
it's go ahead. I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
quite answering
I
your
wanted
question.
to get back to another language question.
Yep.
We talked about the choice of using the word killing and how we, arrive at that. Uh, what words, though, do law enforcement officials often use in these instances? And we often have to almost like translate sometimes because there's this police jargon, and we often change the language so that it's more conversational. How do you handle that? Because we get some of these reports. I'm like, "Now what happened? An adult male did, you know,
Yeah.
there's a whole process of trying to rewrite what police say. But how do we make decisions about this is what police said, but before we report it, do we also need to get some other sources in here to say what happened?
Yes. I mean, if if we're reporting on something that happened outside of our viewing, unfortunately, we're left with the official view, at least in the short term. And if they don't
That's
know
all we
for
can.
sure, they're going to
Mhm.
say officer involved shooting. That's the way they'll describe it.
And that's
And
how
we,
George Floyd started, right?
yep,
Wasn't it? Mm-hmm.
yep. Or well, it wasn't shooting, but officer involved.
Mm-hmm.
Something happened that officers were involved with, and somebody died. And so they they will say things like police discharged weapons, a suspect was hit, and they'll use the word suspect. We don't suspect of what.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we have to really suss out and be careful of using their language when we're not sure what they're basing it on. And also the
Right.
how do you know question, like how do they know? We try to suss out whether there was video at all. We try to suss out whether there were witnesses that we can talk to. If it's something that is not in front of us that we can get to. If it's something that happened in an area where we can get to it, we try to get there and try to talk to people about what they heard and what they saw.
And it
Um,
literally witnesses say this, police
yeah,
say that. And I've
yeah,
been at police news conferences. Sometimes they won't say, unless you ask the question, they won't tell you. And so there's
mhm,
often this, different reporters will be like, well, did this happen to this? And so sometimes they don't always voluntarily tell you everything they know. It's like they wait for reporters to ask them the right question.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah, and I think also with this, with George Floyd's death, this was the mayor coming out immediately and saying they should be fired. That didn't happen much before, and that whole, it's a much more speeded up process, much more. They're saying we're doing this to the officers rather than not even confirming whether they were fired or they left. So that kind of accountability seems to be a little bit more out in the open, but we just have to be aware of where they're coming from and the kind of information that they're giving to us.
And I've been giving a lot of thought. I have of who's coming, the national media, and the national figures that will be in Minnesota for the trial. I remember watching the funeral of George Floyd in Houston, I believe, and Reverend Al Sharpton, who did the eulogy, said to the family, "I'll be back. We're coming back to Minnesota. We'll be there to support the family during the trial." And we don't know the schedules and who's going to be here and who's not going to be here, but we know national media and some national figures are all coming to Minnesota. And how do we handle the coverage of that? Like, there'll be a lot of news conference, like almost like sideshows, right?
Hmm.
In addition to the prosecutors and the defense attorneys, you're going to have a lot of people with a lot to say about what's going on. And so
Yeah,
we have to decide, like what do we air and what do we choose to cover and what do we choose not to?
yeah, which is unlike a lot of trials where you don't have a lot of audio to choose from. I think
Right.
that in this case we'll have the opposite problem. if it's a problem.
Right.
I don't think it's really a problem, but
And we'll get
um,
written statements too, like
yeah,
press releases will come out, like,
yeah,
yeah, it's just gonna be just a lot to kinda, and as an editor, it kinda it comes to you. I'm glad
yeah.
I don't have your job
Or Laura's job.
or Laura's job, right?
But yeah, I think we are pretty good about staying very focused on things um and just, let's just stick to our knitting in terms of what we need to report for our audience. And the rest will take care of itself, hopefully. Um,
Mhm,
and keep a, you know, think about how our audience might react to some things because the content will be so sensitive.
mhm.
So
Yeah, I remember in the, early days after, George Floyd was killed, just, our reporters and me too, we were getting requests to be interviewed, like other news agencies in other parts of the country, like, wanted us to describe what's happening in Minnesota, and so I've been giving thought to that, like, I don't, like, my priority is, my talk show and what I can do,
mm,
but recognizing it's going to be a story that you won't be able to escape, it's gonna be everywhere.
yeah,
For a long time.
yeah. I mean,
Mm.
during the trial of Mohammed Noor, the we were getting calls from Australian broadcasters, and their
Right.
time frame doesn't fit
Mhm.
with ours very well. Um,
Right,
and uh,
right.
and BBC
BBC, beat the time
and
frame, like,
all
"Four
sorts of
o'clock in the
media.
morning? Come on,
Yeah,
BBC, 4 o'clock in the morning?"
I know.
Right,
So
right,
and
it's
and we try to help them out, but and
right.
National Public Radio and
Mhm,
NPR, we believe will have a presence here too. So,
mhm.
but all the national media will be here, I would imagine, from start to finish, unless they've decided, well, we can just listen to it remotely. But I don't think that will be the case.
One question I have too, the other trial that's happening, and why is it that the trial of the other 3 officers is happening at a later time? Is that in August is when those trials begin?
Correct. That's the schedule. Is end of
Why did that
August.
happen? Remind us, the separation.
So, so the trial was the judge believed that the at least he said that it would be too difficult to keep people safe from COVID. He wanted to have the trial in March, and it would be
Mhm,
too difficult to keep the people safe if they had all those additional defendants plus their counsel. It just the
mhm.
courtroom, as big as it is, wouldn't be able to handle that.
Accommodate that, right?
So yeah, and to be safe because they've got partitions up and things like that now. So it's I think
Inside the courtroom?
yeah,
Partition?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Mm.
So that's why there was pressure to have them all together, but that's not the
So, in
decision
terms of
at the moment. Now, that's the other thing. Could it all be delayed? I mean, the prosecution wanted it all pushed back, and maybe outside of when COVID would be an issue. Of course, we don't really know when that's going to be. So,
so if we look at the timeline again, March 8th is the beginning of jury selection.
mhm,
March 29th, I think you said tentatively, the opening statements in the
right.
Chauvin trial, could last a couple of months, so April, May, and then August we start again. A very long timetable
Hmm.
for this.
If that
Any,
if that sticks, yeah.
if it sticks,
Hmm.
any idea of who will be testifying in the
Yeah.
trial of Derek Chauvin?
We don't know for sure. The prosecution turned in a list that actually had 360 names on it, I believe.
Say that again.
360 names on the prosecution list. But who knows if all those people will be testifying? That's a lot. And the defense also had a lengthy list. So we would expect, as I mentioned before, that the medical examiner um, will be called to, almost certainly will be called to testify. Um, the um, the other 3 officers are on the list too for the prosecution. So
To testify in
correct.
the trial of Derek Chauvin? Mm.
Yep. And then um, also the police chief is on. Madeira Arredondo is on the list.
Mm,
and also the person who shot the bystander video of Floyd's
mhm,
death. Um, and uh, a lot of expert witnesses as they've had, on perhaps having to do with medical conditions, um, having to do with use of force,
mhm.
to try
The
to say
experts,
this is what police do when confronted with
right.
a situation like this.
You see me taking
So,
my deep breaths again, Nancy? I mean, just I mean, because,
yeah,
police officers testifying against police officers, that in itself, it is like, what is that going to look like? What will that be
right.
like?
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it's not unheard of for officers to do that, and that did happen before, that they would talk about, and it is,
mhm.
it still is pretty astonishing, I think. Um, but, they can also testify for the defense about, the culture and that kind of thing,
And what do you
perhaps.
do with hours and hours of testimony, and then, a reporter's story may have to be, I don't know, a minute, 2 minutes, some segments might be 3 or 4. I mean, that whole process of what to include and what not to include, how is that handled?
Well, you focus on the newest thing that happened, the thing that probably has the most importance. It is hard because you are in the weeds. If you're a
Mhm.
reporter, you're really steeped in what's going on. And I think the benefit of this one, maybe not, is that we're listening to it. I mean, maybe we'll be just as in the weeds
Right.
as they are,
I'm just thinking like
as
all the
opposed to just
notes,
going,
like
tell me the bit, tell
right.
me what's
Yeah,
important here.
right.
Um, so I guess I hadn't really thought of that, but that could be a danger. But
And then
yeah, it's
social media, right? Because
exactly
the listeners and our readers have the expectation that they can also follow along on social media, and
right.
so reporters, there's an obligation there too, to do updates on social media. It's just
And
it's
they'll
a
be doing
lot,
that too. Yep.
right? Uh, one of our listeners, probably more than one of our listeners, is asking this question. Could we share a bit about the difficulty of journalists' personal views on this particular story? Was this a difficult story for journalists to cover? Uh, I can start with that. I mean, yeah, I mean,
Please.
because, we're people too. We live in this community, these are our neighborhoods and you know, um, this is our home also. And so yeah, I mean, I have, personally just struggled and just have had times where like I just didn't want to, I didn't want to talk to anybody, much less be on the air talking about, what happened and how our community is hurting and and trying to just understand like what to do, because there's just been so many feelings. But in the moment when you're on the air, you go into this mode, okay, I was trained to do this. So we talk about fact, we talk about getting as many perspectives as possible in the conversation, and you sort of focus on what you know is, actually helpful to the listeners, more so than your personal opinions. But yeah, obviously, we all have personal opinions. The question is, what do we do with them? There are conversations we have with our family and friends, and then there are conversations we have on the air for the benefit of our listeners. I don't know if that helps, or what are your thoughts though? Like what do we know in terms of training, or how are journalists supposed to be, I guess, not biased is sort of the question.
Yeah. Perhaps not enough training in situations like this, right?
Actually, yeah, we don't really.
I mean, I feel like not enough, especially allowing, because I came up, your feelings are over here. Who you are is over here, and what you're doing is here. And you apply that to everybody in the room, right? And that's not really a good way to go. And also, everybody is processing this differently.
Hmm.
Um, and are not maybe wanting to say, look, I need time, and they really need time. And so we've tried to make it allow people to have that, in the moment after, while things were happening, just do you need time? Just trying to suss that out and not making people say, look, I really can't do it. um, was sort of front and center for me as somebody who was kind of involved in the coverage in the aftermath.
Right.
Um, because I can't put myself in another person's place and completely. And so I
Right.
feel like recognizing the feelings are really important at this point if we can do that. Um,
Right. Because there isn't a lot of recovery time, right? I mean, I just know
None.
what it was like, and again, I mean, this is probably my issue with the trial coverage because it's reliving uh,
Right.
every awful moment that happened in um, late May, early June, all over again. But
Mm,
trying to talk about it in a way that is respectful to everyone. But there's just pain all around.
mhm.
And there's no way to avoid that.
Yeah.
Um, Let's share another question. Tess is asking this. What does it mean to say the discussion about change of venue would continue after the trial? Does that mean during an appeal? So once
Potentially.
they've established the venue, I mean, that's not going to change,
Mm-mm.
but if there's an appeal, it could be someplace else. Is that
Maybe, or it is something, and I can't get in the head of a defense attorney,
mm,
if they lose the case, if that's something that they might pick as, well, the jury was biased, and I mean, that's something that they'll put out potentially, but
mm.
we'll just have to see what they put out after it's over.
Here's a question from Bethany. Bethany is asking, do we know if all the jury members have to be residents of Minneapolis? And someone else is asking what criteria determines the bias of jury members. So, in general, what do we know about
It's really hard.
the rules for jury members? Do they have to be Minneapolis residents,
I believe they do, but I don't know for sure,
or
actually.
maybe
That's a
Hennepin
really good
County
question.
residents?
Yeah,
I don't know
I
that
believe
either.
it's a pool from, but I don't know for sure.
Right. And in general, what are the instructions? Do jury members get in a trial like this? Because they do get instruction, not training, but like, here are your instructions. Like, this is the charge, and these are the things that you would need to agree on to support this
Mhm.
charge.
That's really something that's important to pay attention to when the trial is happening, because the
Hmm.
judge does that. And so what one judge has said to jurors in one case isn't necessarily what Judge Cahill will do in this case. So I would encourage people who are planning to listen to um, all the way through to, closing arguments and beyond, to listen to what the judge has, and we will report that what the judge has told the jury to consider,
Mm.
because it can be specific, and that's an important piece that sometimes is maybe something more for people who are steeped in the legalities of it, but it's key.
As a journalist who's covered trials and courtroom proceedings, let's talk about opening statements and closing arguments. I feel like, television has really distorted just the
Oh yeah.
opening statements and closing arguments, and that they're not always as theatrical as you see on TV. But in this particular trial, what are your expectations? What do you think we'll see in the opening statements
Boy, that's a really good
from each
question.
side?
I mean,
Did,
I would say they would probably touch on the evidence in the autopsy. I think they would touch on the video, the prosecution would, and you know, how long um, Mr. Floyd was on the ground under, one officer with his knee on his neck, and another two holding him even after, um, one couldn't get a pulse. Um, so that kind of thing will come up, and I imagine the defense will talk about, um, what Mr. Floyd was like before, and we'll bring up the autopsy too. So
I mean,
I
before
it's
that
hard to
day, the
say.
hours before he was arrested, what was his state?
Yeah, and or he got on the ground, that kind of thing. Um, so
And
I
we've
don't
seen
know.
we know that we've done some stories about what will be restricted, what they won't be allowed to bring in as part of the evidence on both sides. Like part of it, like previous arrest and just
Mhm.
the background of the of Chauvin, like what can and cannot be
Right.
part of the trial. We've seen some news in that.
Yeah. Yeah. So nothing from George Floyd's past, as far as that goes, um, and or his interactions with police. But the judge did say that um, there are two instances that can be brought in about Chauvin and his conduct as a police
His
officer.
his record as an officer.
Yeah, yeah. And one is
Um,
an incident that was similar in which someone was pinned to the ground by the neck, that he
mhm.
had pinned that person a few years or several years before.
A listener, Nancy, is asking, will you be reporting on what kind of support is available to community members who will be reliving this trauma?
Wow, that's
Great
good.
question. I did a talk show recently
Hmm.
with Dr. Joy Lewis and Dr. Brittany Lewis talking about Time of Reckoning, which is a series of conversations that they've been hosting on criminal justice reform. And Joy Lewis talked about meeting with the governor and other leaders about creating spaces. Like we know people are going to be, we'll need someone to talk to. So can we get
Yeah.
ahead of it and plan? Like have some spaces that you can go and talk to folks and have, trained healers there who can facilitate discussions that might help. Uh, I would be. I mean, those are legitimate news stories, right? How the
Hmm.
community is responding to the trial.
Oh yeah. Yeah, because and also to have a statewide approach to that too, I think might be important, just because
Mhm.
we shouldn't assume that this is only, this is a nationwide, worldwide
Right.
re-experiencing. But I think, yes, I think that's a really good idea because if we profile people who are taking care of each other, then other people get ideas about how to do that. Um,
I want and we
and
wanna
that
hear
would be
those
really
ideas.
interesting.
We should tell people too, if you
Exactly.
know of events that
Yes,
are happening,
please.
tell us so get that helps us with our coverage. That helps us have
Yeah.
ideas of where we can send our
Yep.
reporters or even for me, talk show guests.
Yep.
Um, I would love to talk about that. Here's a question from a student journalist, Nancy. Maddie says she's a student journalist. She identifies as white and has been assigned to cover stories around race. Do you have any recommendations to share about things to remember? Yeah, covering race relations has been something that is a part of everybody's beat right now, right? Whether it doesn't matter if you're a health reporter, if you're a journal assignment, the discussions about race have it's really been everyone's job this
Mhm.
year, this past year. And so
Yeah.
for student journalists, and we will see student journalists covering the trial, they're going to be part of this as well.
Mhm.
Any advice?
Uh, read as much as you can,
Mm,
um, and read um, essays, as many essays as you can, and listen to as many podcasts as you can. Listen to Angela's show. Um, and I mean that seriously. Listen to what people say and how they say it, and then reflect on what was your first reaction when you heard that, and and
mhm,
kind of question yourself. If not, take account of it in a formal way. Um, but I think that's the main thing to do. There are lots of things you should do, um, but but mostly listening in the beginning and reading as much as you can, and assume that you don't know really
mhm.
anything.
Mhm. And to be careful, right? If they're trying to
Exactly.
go out to be in the middle, to be in the mix, to please be careful not to go
Yes.
places by yourself, have a
Right.
buddy system, right? But
Yeah.
something you said there, in a lot of the reading and research that I do for my talk shows, I keep that in mind when I'm reading. And if I have a moment where I'm like, oh, wow, I make a note of that and that's like, oh, well, if I had that reaction to learning this, then that's a good question or that's something that I should
Exactly.
have in the discussion because the audience would likely have that reaction too.
Yep.
Good luck to you, to
Yes. Very
Maddie.
good luck, Manny. Keep going.
Let's see, another question here. So some questions here about the aftermath and how we've covered the response. And Mary is asking, I think we talked about this. She says, how do you decide how much background and context to get into? For example, Mary says, I learned a lot about economic discrimination after Floyd was killed. And so we know how just like the effect that this Floyd case has had on like everything. Um, and so what role has NPR played in helping people understand things that they didn't had never considered before, particularly with racial disparities?
Yeah. Um, I think we really need to keep it going. Um, we have tried to do stories wherever possible about disparities as far as the justice system goes,
Hmm.
and what can be done about that, especially starting at the policing level, because that's the main discussion that's going on right now. There's a story I included in an award entry I just submitted, that Dan Crocker did in Duluth with a man named John Stain, who worked for the county government there, and he was an assessor. And just if you want to look it up, I think it's well worth a listen, because it's about one person who kept getting stopped by security in his own place of work,
Hmm.
and what he did in an individual level and what he felt about that. And so giving space for people to tell stories like that in our news, programs, I think is an important effort we'll continue to do.
Hmm.
I think we're probably overdue in doing an assessment of where people are economically, where some of the successes are, maybe in getting more contracts for people of color at the state level, which we examined years ago and found terrible disparities. That was reporting by Emma Sapone. Um, and, just especially after the pandemic, that's the other thing, is kind of everything's just so
Yeah,
crashing in
wish
on us,
together,
right?
right?
And so I know that's what we're looking at too in terms of the pandemic. So there's a lot of things going on as far as how people are going to emerge from this,
Mhm.
um, that we
And the
will continue to
businesses, the
cover.
small businesses that have, are
Yes.
still trying to recover from, the damage that their buildings, um, had during the civil unrest. That's been an
Mhm.
ongoing story, and the difficulty that they've had coming back, and the aid and the loans that they've been able to get or not get. That's
Yeah.
been, and also further complicated by the pandemic. Another question Betty asked: does the jury need to be unanimous in its verdict in the trial of Derek Chauvin? Do we know? Does it have to be a unanimous verdict?
I believe it does. Yeah. Yeah.
And another listener is asking, during the unrest, many
I mean,
journalists.
I should take that
Oh,
back. I mean, the jury can decide they can't come to a verdict.
right. So that would be a hung
So that
jury,
could be one that
right?
could be one outcome, is
We
that they
can't
can't
decide.
decide. But yeah.
Mhm. Um, another listener is asking in our final minutes here, during the unrest, many journalists were injured. How do you direct journalists to cover that without bias while experiencing that? How can they possibly be objective in those stressful situations? Many journalists walked away from some of the protests. Um, they got hurt,
Yeah.
uh, and some of them even emotionally wounded, right, or just traumatized by what they witnessed. Um, and so they still carry that with them, like, but it's got to keep working.
Right.
How to express
It's
that?
part of a professional ethic, right? I mean, you have to keep going if you're in the middle of a conflict. You have to still be able to talk to people on all sides of the conflict, if you can, and just keep your eye on that story, and try to. I mean, it's incredibly difficult. Um, and as a manager, you just have to be in touch with reporters and just, can you do this? Is this something you can do, or do you need to step away from it,
Mm.
and to be able to give them a chance to do that if they have to.
Nancy, what's the best way for someone who's listening or to submit a story idea or to get our attention to cover something that they feel like we're missing? What's the
Yeah.
best way to do that?
Well, they can always send a tweet to at NPR News. They can also contact us on our Facebook page. We do have engagement reporter or an engagement effort. Um,
Hmm.
and the good old fashioned pick up the phone is fine too, and
We're
call the
still
newsroom.
answering phone calls. Yes, we are.
Yes, we
Yeah.
are.
Because
Um,
yeah, I want to know. We're
remotely.
always, meeting, looking for story ideas.
Yeah.
Like we want to hear from our community members about what they
Yep.
want to learn more
We do.
about, who they want to hear from, who's not on our radar. We do want those ideas. I want to make sure before we let you go, Nancy, that we remind everyone too that tomorrow at noon, also on Zoom, I'll be leading a discussion about one of our In Focus events, which is this ongoing conversation that we started beginning in June about how the persistent racial disparities that we're seeing in Minnesota. But tomorrow I'll be talking about um, incarceration and that path from incarceration to inclusion. What happens to people after they're released from prison when they go try to find housing, when they look for jobs? Like, what do we know about that experience, and what can we do as a state to be more welcoming and to help these folks? And so I've got 4 guests lined up tomorrow who can speak very personally about this process. And that's tomorrow at noon on Zoom. You can register. Go to nprevents.org and it's free. And I'll be back in this chair talking about that tomorrow at noon.
Great.
Nancy Liebens, I'm going to let you go. Our time is up. Nancy is our deputy managing editor here at NPR News, overseeing news coverage of multiple confrontations between police and people suspected of crimes. She's helping to lead our coverage of the upcoming trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin and has helped make a lot of the decisions in the killing of George Floyd since that happened in May. Nancy, thank you for your time. I know you have lots of meetings. I
No
have learned a
problem.
lot, and I'm
Good.
glad that you are here with us at NPR News in a leadership position. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
All
I
right.
appreciate you too. Thank you so much. This is great.
Yeah, and for those of you tuning in, thank you for your time. This has been an Ask NPR News event, and we look forward to having you be with us as we continue to bring you coverage across Minnesota of what is happening and affecting our communities here.